There is a wall in Egypt that has been standing for over 3,000 years. Carved into its stone in precise hieroglyphic text is a complete list of kings. Not myths, not poems, kings. Names, reigns, dates. A record so detailed that modern historians still use it to piece together ancient chronology. A Roman scholar who walked past that same wall would have read parts of it and said, "Yes, very interesting. A lovely piece of religious storytelling." And that gap, that single gap between what one civilization called history and what another called legend, changed everything about how we understand the ancient world. Welcome to Eternal Legends, where the past refuses to stay buried. I'm glad you're here. If this is your first time on the channel, hit subscribe right now, because what we do here is dig into the stories that empires tried to erase, rewrite, or simply walk past without looking. Leave a comment below this video and tell me, when you think about ancient Egypt, do you think of myth or do you think of history? That question is the whole point of today's video. And the answer might genuinely surprise you. Think about the moment Rome encountered Egypt seriously. Not as a trading partner, not as a distant curiosity, but as a conquered territory. It was the year 30 BC. Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, sailed into Alexandria after the end of one of the ancient world's most dramatic political collapses. Cleopatra was dead. The Ptolemaic dynasty was finished. Egypt, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, was now a province. And when Roman administrators, scholars, and writers began to engage with Egyptian sacred texts, priestly records, and temple inscriptions, they ran into a problem. A very specific problem of categorization. Egypt had records of gods who ruled as kings before humans did. It had king lists that stretched back tens of thousands of years before any currently known dynasty. It had stories of divine succession, cosmic battles, and the resurrection of a slain god that its priests encoded not in the language of poetry, but in the language of administrative record. For a Roman mind shaped by Greek philosophy and Roman law, this created a kind of intellectual short circuit. Either Egypt was claiming that gods literally walked the earth and ruled as pharaohs, which seemed like religious mythology, or the priests were using mythological language to describe something else entirely. Most Roman writers chose the second option without really asking the Egyptians which one it was. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian writing under Roman influence in the 1st century BC, spent considerable time describing Egypt. He recorded that Egyptians believed Osiris and Isis had been actual rulers of Egypt before the mortal dynasties. His response to this was largely to treat it as allegory. A beautiful story, he suggested, in which Osiris represented the gifts of agriculture and civilization, and his conflict with Set represented the struggle between fertile land and desert. Neat, clean, entirely Roman in its logic. Here is what Diodorus did not do. He did not ask why Egyptian temple walls, administrative priestly records, and what we now call the Turin King List place these divine rulers at the literal head of a chronological sequence. The Turin King List, a papyrus document that Egyptologists believe was compiled from much older sources, lists the divine rulers of Egypt, then the semi-divine, then mortal pharaohs in an unbroken line. It is written in the same format, the same bureaucratic hand, the same documentary style as the mortal records on either side of it. There is no stylistic shift that says, and now we move from history to myth. The Egyptians made no such distinction. That is not carelessness. That is a completely different philosophy of what the past is for. For Rome, the past served a largely civic and moral purpose. Roman historians wrote to explain how the Republic rose, why certain values mattered, what lessons a citizen should draw from great men's choices. Myth in Rome was largely separated from official history, given its own category, attributed to poets like Virgil or Ovid. When Virgil wrote the Aeneid, Everyone understood it as a literary work with political undertones. It was magnificent. It was not a legal document. In Egypt, the boundary between those two things barely existed. A sacred text was also an administrative claim. A story about Horus defeating Set was also a theological justification for every pharaoh who ever sat on a throne, because the pharaoh was Horus. Not metaphorically, literally. By title, by ritual, by divine right that was renewed with every coronation. The story was not a poem to be admired. It was a founding document being reenacted in real time. That is the wall Rome walked past without understanding. And what do you think? When two civilizations have such different ideas of what counts as real, who gets to decide? Write it in the comments. Let us go deeper into how Egypt actually built its memory, because this is where the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Egyptian writing was not a casual system. Hieroglyphs were called medu necher, the words of the gods. Writing something down in hieroglyphs was a sacred act. Temple walls were not decorated, they were activated. The images and texts carved into stone were believed to operate perpetually, to function as long as the stone stood. When a priest carved the name of a god alongside a ritual scene, that scene was not commemorating something that happened. It was keeping that thing happening forever, in a permanent present tense. This changes how you read everything on those walls. A scene of Ramesses II defeating his enemies at Kadesh is not primarily a war report. It is a metaphysical statement about the nature of kingship, order versus chaos, and the eternal role of the pharaoh as the being who holds the world together. The battle happened. The records confirm it happened. But the reason it was carved in enormous scale across temple pylons was not journalism. It was theology in stone. Now bring a Roman administrator into that space and ask him what he sees. He sees propaganda. He sees a king bragging about a military victory in religious language. He categorizes it. He moves on. What he does not see, what his entire intellectual framework prevents him from seeing, is that the Egyptians were not making a distinction between propaganda and theology in the first place. To them, those were the same gesture. The king lists drive this point home with particular force. Egypt produced several of them. The Palermo stone, the Abydos King List, the Saqqara tablet, the Turin King List. Each of these documents records the sequence of Egypt's rulers in a form that is clearly meant to be authoritative. The Abydos King List, carved into the temple of Seti I, shows Seti and his young son Ramesses, who would become Ramesses II, making offerings before the cartouches of 76 previous kings, stretching back to the very beginning. This was not a decorative frieze. This was a statement of legitimate succession. By standing in that hall and naming those kings, Seti was claiming membership in a continuous chain of divine authority that began before human memory. And the priests who designed that hall believed every name on that wall was real. The divine rulers, the semi-divine rulers, the mortal pharaohs, all of them real. All of them part of the same unbroken line of authority that the current pharaoh was inheriting and continuing. Manetho understood this intimately. Manetho was an Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egypt in Greek during the early 3rd century BC, during the reign of Ptolemy II. He was asked, essentially, to translate Egyptian sacred history into a form that a Greek-speaking world could access. His work, called Egyptiaca, divided Egyptian history into the dynasties we still use today. That numbering system, First Dynasty, Second Dynasty, and so on, comes from Manetho. But he also included the divine and semi-divine rulers at the beginning of his chronology, placing them in the sequence exactly as Egyptian tradition demanded. Later Greek and Roman writers who used Manetho's work as a source largely stripped those early sections out or quarantined them in footnotes with phrases like, according to legend, or if we are to believe the priests. They kept the historical dynasties, they discarded the divine ones. Not because they proved them false, simply because the categories did not fit. That editorial decision, repeated across generations of classical scholarship, is one of the most consequential moments in how the ancient world was preserved and transmitted. Manetho wrote a complete record. What survived, and how it survived, was shaped by readers who had already decided in advance which parts were history and which parts were not. Here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who assumed this was a simple case of sophisticated Romans correcting superstitious Egyptians. Consider the figure known to the Greeks as Sesostris. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, describes a great Egyptian conqueror named Sesostris who led campaigns across Asia, into Thrace and Macedonia, and down into sub-Saharan Africa. He describes Sesostris erecting pillars in conquered territories, some inscribed with declarations of victory, others, where the enemy had resisted with particular courage, inscribed with a symbol meant to honor that courage. Herodotus says he personally saw some of these pillars still standing. Herodotus treats this story with a mixture of credence and skepticism that is typical of his style. He is not sure how much to believe. He notes that some of what the priests told him was beyond belief, and yet he records it because he is genuinely trying to understand what Egyptian tradition preserved. Roman writers who came later were more dismissive. By the time Strabo and Pliny were writing, Sesostris had begun to slide from historical figure into legendary one. A convenient peg on which fabulous stories got hung. A symbol, an archetype, perhaps an amalgam. Modern Egyptology has since identified Sesostris as almost certainly a composite memory of the great 12th dynasty pharaohs. Senusret I, Senusret II, Senusret III. Rulers of the Middle Kingdom who did conduct substantial military campaigns, did expand Egyptian influence into Nubia and the Levant, and did leave physical monuments behind. The memory was real. The scale had grown in the telling. But Rome's process of labeling it legend meant that for centuries, scholars treated Sesostris as pure invention, and the genuine historical core underneath was buried. That is the mechanism this video is about. Not whether Rome was lying and Egypt was telling the truth. Both civilizations shaped their records to serve their present needs. Rome erased inconvenient emperors from official records with a practice called damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, literally chiseling a disgraced ruler's name off monuments. Egypt did something structurally similar. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, had her images systematically removed from temple walls after her death, her monuments reclaimed by her successor. Neither civilization was a neutral archive. The difference was in the declared purpose of the record. Rome wrote history to explain the present. Egypt wrote history to sustain the present. Roman historians understood themselves as analysts, looking backward at events that had occurred. Egyptian priests understood themselves as participants in a cosmic order that never stopped unfolding. When an Egyptian scribe recorded a divine king, he was not making a claim about the distant past the way a Roman historian would. He was affirming that the principle of divine kingship, still active in the current pharaoh, had always been true and would always be true. Time worked differently, authority worked differently, and so the records looked different, and were read differently, and survived differently. And that difference, write it in the comments. Do you think it matters? When one civilization calls something sacred history and another calls it legend, does it change what actually happened, or just what we're allowed to believe? We have arrived at the final question, and it is the one that matters most for anyone alive today who cares about how we understand the ancient world. When Rome translated Egyptian memory into Roman categories, something was lost that we have never fully recovered. This is not a romantic complaint. It is a structural observation about how information moves across cultures and what happens when a dominant civilization becomes the filter through which a conquered one is remembered. Rome was extraordinarily effective at transmission. The Roman Empire produced writers, administrators, and scholars who recorded enormous amounts of material about the cultures they absorbed. Without Herodotus, Diodorus, Strabo, Plutarch, and Pliny, we would know far less about ancient Egypt than we do. That is a genuine debt. But transmission is not the same as preservation. When you transmit something through a foreign framework, you keep the content and change the meaning. Plutarch's essay on Isis and Osiris is one of the most complete accounts of that myth that survives from antiquity. Plutarch was a serious scholar, genuinely respectful of Egyptian religion, and he worked hard to understand it. But his essay is written in the tradition of Greek philosophical inquiry. He treats the Osiris story as a profound philosophical allegory about the soul, the body, and the forces of nature. He is not wrong that the story contains those dimensions, but by presenting it exclusively through that lens, he strips away the dimension that Egyptian priests would have considered primary. That Osiris was a real king whose real death and real resurrection established the real principle by which every pharaoh was legitimately divine. To Plutarch, that dimension was mythology. To the priests of Abydos, who conducted the annual Osiris mysteries, dramatic reenactments of the god's death and return that drew pilgrims from across Egypt, that dimension was the living center of their entire civilization's identity. The word legend carries within it a judgment. It signals that something is not quite history, not quite real, perhaps instructive or beautiful, but ultimately not to be taken seriously as a factual account. When Roman and later European scholars applied that word to Egyptian sacred chronology, they were not simply describing a category, they were assigning a rank. History was at the top, legend was below it. And the further you were from the Roman and later European center of intellectual authority, the more quickly your records got filed under legend. This had consequences that echoed for nearly 2,000 years. When early modern scholars began seriously studying Egypt in the 17th and 18th centuries, they arrived with the categories already in place. Sacred texts were allegory. Divine king lists were mythology. Priestly records were religious propaganda. The only parts worth taking seriously as history were the ones that could be corroborated by Greek and Roman sources. Sources that themselves had been filtered, selected, and reframed. The decipherment of hieroglyphs by Champollion in 1822 changed the game, but it did not immediately change the categories. Scholars could now read Egyptian texts directly, but they read them through 2,000 years of accumulated assumption about what Egyptian records were for and how seriously to take them. That assumption has been slowly, painstakingly dismantled over the last century of Egyptology. But it has not been fully dismantled. The question of how much historical content lies inside Egyptian sacred chronology, the divine and semi-divine dynasties, the vast timescales, the accounts of primordial kingship, remains genuinely open in ways that mainstream scholarship is only recently beginning to sit with honestly. What we can say with confidence is this: Egypt preserved its memory in a system built for permanence. Stone walls, priestly lineages, ritual repetition, canonical king lists copied and recopied across dynasties. That system was designed to resist exactly what eventually happened to it: conquest, reinterpretation, the imposition of foreign categories. And in many ways, it did resist. The walls are still standing. The texts are still readable. The king lists still show the divine rulers at the head of the sequence, exactly where the priests placed them, refusing to be moved. Rome called it legend. Egypt called it history. And the difference between those two words is not just a matter of ancient academic debate. It is the difference between a civilization whose memory was taken seriously on its own terms and one whose memory was translated into someone else's language, and then judged by rules it was never designed to follow. The next time you read that a story from the ancient world is merely mythological, ask yourself, according to whom? Who made that call? When did they make it? And what did they assume before they ever started reading? Because sometimes what one empire dismissed as legend is what another civilization spent 3,000 years trying to make sure you would never forget. That is eternal legends. Thank you for watching. If this video gave you something to think about, leave a comment right now. I read all of them, and I want to know your take. Did Rome do something unforgivable when it filtered Egyptian memory through its own lens? Or was that just how empires have always worked? Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. The past is not done with us yet.